Welcome to Expresso News, the news show from Coffee Corner Motorsport Full Beans, where I bring you all the latest from the paddock to the podcast via my shed and, of course, whilst drinking far too much coffee, probably than what's good for my health. Now, this week, I've got Lewis Hamilton and Barcelona testing. I've also got Adrian Newey and his concerns regarding new regulations. We've got more on Yuki Tsunoda's role with Red Bull after that announcement they made regarding reserve drivers this week. And, of course, we've got Johnny Herbert and the FIA stewards and, of course, what they're doing with their new stewards department they set up. So if all of that takes your fancy, grab yourself a coffee, grab yourself a 30 minutes to listen to the podcast, sit down, strap in, and let's give it some full beans. Now, for those who are new, this is, of course, Coffee Corner Motorsport Full Beans podcast. This show is my Formula One show called Expresso News, where I bring you all of the weekly headlines from my page in a little bit more detail. So for those who follow me on social media, you'll know that I post daily headlines where I just give you a snapshot of what's going on in the Formula One world. This podcast picks 4 or 5 of those headlines and delves into them in a little bit more detail. Now, this is episode 3 of this format for this season. So, of course, if you haven't already, please go back and check out episode 2 and episode 1. And if you haven't already, please drop a like, a follow, a subscribe button, whatever's available to you on the network or the podcast you're listening to this on, just so I can boost my numbers up and feel like there's actually somebody out there listening to the podcast and it's not just me rambling on in my shed. But with all of that in mind, all that housekeeping out of the way, I'm not going to keep you much longer. Grab your coffee and let's talk Lewis Hamilton, Barcelona testing, and just what happened. So, the big news that came out via Italian Motorsport this week is, of course, Lewis Hamilton crashing in Barcelona during that pre-season test for Ferrari. Now, he was there as part of a 3-day test along with Charles Leclerc and, of course, a couple of Ferrari's reserve drivers. And the whole point was to get him more familiar with the car. They're using the 2023 SF23. We know that he had a couple of laps in it last week at the launch of his first week with Ferrari, but this was all about finding limits on the car, getting him used to the car, getting him actually driving it at pace and used to the controls, and giving, of course, Ferrari that all-important feedback on what's good, what's bad, what could be done better, to basically make him more familiar with not just the car, of course, the steering wheel and everything about Ferrari, because basically Lewis hasn't driven anything bar Mercedes engines for the whole of his Formula One career, and we may not think it with the engine equalization that's come into play, that all of the engines are quite similar, but actually there are differences between how the car works, what the biting points are, what the acceleration is, gear changes, steering wheel layout, all of this stuff plays into it, which Lewis has got to learn all from scratch. So that was the whole point behind this. Now, day 1, we had Charles in the car. Day 2 was supposed to be a combination of Lewis and then Charles in the afternoon. And then, of course, we were supposed to have the rookies taken over for the final day of testing in Barcelona. Now, day 1 went without any hitches. We saw some photos of Charles on track. We saw some photos of Lewis on the pit wall, also meeting with the engineers, no problem at all. Then about lunchtime on Wednesday, we started getting news that there had been a crash in Barcelona regarding Lewis Hamilton. Now, we're saying that this happened apparently at 11 a.m., track time that was, and it's not a bad crash. There's no damage to Lewis himself. He's completely fine. The car suffered suspension damage and what they call aero problems. So mainly he's smashed at the nose, etc. on that car, the front wing. It's a safe bet to say, or the rear wing or something. We not seen many photos of it. There's been some footage, but I'm not sure how accurate it is. But ultimately, he lost it in the final turn, the final sector, and it's said by Ferrari that he's hit a bump and he's gone off into the barriers via the sort of gravel trap. Now, you'll remember that the actual final sector in Barcelona was changed a few years ago, so it's a lot more fast, a lot more flat out now. It used to, of course, have that chicane in it. They took that out to make it faster. This is clearly just Lewis Hamilton finding the limit of the car. Let's not make any beef about it or any bones about it or read into it anything else than that. This is purely Lewis Hamilton finding where that limit is on the Ferrari and just being caught out by either bump, cold tyres, and then taking it into the barriers, unfortunately. It meant that Charles couldn't get out for his afternoon yesterday. And with the plan already predetermined with the reserve drivers coming in for the final day on Thursday, that meant that running was then over for the team for those 2 drivers. The thing that got me, the thing that kind of shocked me the most was people's reaction on social media. Now, there will be an element of people who are quite happy that Lewis has crashed. They're quite gleefully, bask in his glory of a 7-time world champion who's passed there over the hill, can't even drive it during the test. Then there's the camp who are very firmly, he's finding limits, it's a mistake, this is what testing is for, this is why the teams do it, this is what goes on with it, this is why. And you kind of got to, go, I agree with that. But like I say, what got me was the shock of how people are going, it's okay, he crashed for McLaren and Mercedes in his first test, and look how that turned out. And this whole demeanour that it's actually okay and normal and fine to do so. And it kind of got me thinking about our reaction to other drivers and what happens when they crash. Because ultimately, Lewis is experienced enough, is successful enough to be afforded the benefit of the doubt when a mistake happens. So, like I say, everyone, or the vast majority, I should say, not everybody, but the vast majority of people are quite happy going, oh, it's Lewis, it's fine, he's tested limits. Is that no different to what Kimi Antonelli did in free practice in Monza last season, where, of course, his first time on the track, he went out, pushed far too hard, far too fast, went off. Yet, at that situation, there was complete uproar that he had crashed the car, that Mercedes should have done better with the planning, that he should have been prepped better. They shouldn't have put him on the soft. They should have eased him in. They should have done all these things. Logan Sargent, for example. Now, I'm not for 1 minute comparing, Kimi Antonelli or Logan Sargent to Lewis Hamilton in terms of driving ability. But there is an element of how we perceive things. So Logan Sargent in his final race for Williams had that brand new Williams car. We know it was heavily remodeled. It was heavily reworked. And he went out, pushed it too hard, hit a bit of the grass, went off into the barrier. Is that not the same? Is most crashes from a Formula One driver not them pushing the limit and finding it? Now, I know with this is testing, it does have an effect on the championship, it does have an effect on the cost cut, really. It's okay to do it in testing, and it's very different to when you've got a team racing against the clock to fix your car for qualifying, and you've done it 5 or 6 times before, and it's having a massive cost capping implication. My thinking was, though, is most crashes just not, if they've got no contact with the driver, are most crashes not just drivers pushing beyond the limit, trying to find some extra pace? And it's just a really interesting theory for me that a 7-time world champion is afforded the luxury of the majority going, it's okay. Whereas a rookie, if this was Jack Doohan, if this was before Australia, there would be a mass clamour for Franco Colapinto to come into that car. And it just made me thinking how the public and how the influence and how we as fans influence what's going on and how it's perceived by media and by everybody else in just how we interact with these incidents that happen. And do you know what? Maybe we should give the drivers a bit more benefit of the doubt when they're pushing the limits and they make a mistake. Just food for thought. But with Ferrari, that's now over. They've got a Pirelli tyre test due, which is in the 2024 car, which will be Lewis's chance to have the most update Ferrari available to him. It's going to be adapted with those Pirelli tyres for 2026 we talked about last week, so I'm not going to dwell on that one. But as far as it's concerned, Ferrari have put it down to a bump. They said it's just a simple mistake. He hit a bump. It took him off across the gravel into the barriers. It's just one of those things, and we all move on. But there you have it. That is Lewis Hamilton in Barcelona, which brings us on to Adrian Newey and engine regulations and Honda's comments regarding their new engine for Aston Martin in 2026. Now, the reason this has made the news is we know that Adrian is facing an uphill battle with Aston Martin. We know there's some questions about the driver lineup. We know there's some questions about how much influence he can have on the team. We also know there's some issues around when he gets started. So we know that currently you can develop your 2026 car in the wind tunnel and the computer zones. And most of the teams are full speed ahead and heading towards that. What we're now in is a situation where Aston Martin are in a bit of limbo. They've moved Dan Fallows to a different role. They're waiting for Adrian to take office, which isn't until March. So when he starts, he's already openly said that he's going to be 2-3 months behind all of the Formula One teams. Now, of course, you can hold your development and you can then plough it into the final sort of, 9-10 months of the year, and you can catch up. Of course you can. It's up to you how you spend that development time. It's up to you how you allocate it. So there's no development issue on that point. It's purely a time issue about being behind. Now, with regards to what Adrian's been saying, so he's saying he's behind. He's also talked about openly about how Red Bull have taken their tools away from him. So he's not designing anything to do with Formula One at the moment. He's got no impact with the team because, of course, he's serving out his leave with Red Bull. He's just working on the road car project, so he's not actually doing anything with the Formula One team and hasn't done since probably Miami onwards, is what he's saying. So he's saying he's kind of out of the picture. Now, I don't believe for 1 minute that Adrian stopped sketching, and I don't believe for 1 minute that Adrian has no ideas on what's going on with 2026 cars and regulations. If anything, he's probably rested and ready to go with that red notebook of his. But what does it mean? Because he's talking about the new regulations. So he talks about with regards to the new regulations, how he feels that this could be a dominant combustion engine series once more, a bit like when Mercedes came with the hybrid era back in, was it 2014, I believe it was? And we saw that Mercedes engine just dominate. And he's saying we've got the potential to have the same thing again, where it doesn't matter how good your aero package is, a dominant engine could dominate the whole of the regulations. And the reason he's saying this is a couple of things. Number one is, for the first time ever, you've got the regulations for the aerodynamics and the chassis changing at the same time as the engine changes. Now, most fans of Formula One will know we normally only do one or the other. Now, we can do them in succession, so we can do them within a year or two of each other. But it's very rare, if not unheard of, certainly in modern times, to change both the engine regulations and the chassis regulations at the same time. He's also talked about how the new chassis regulations are geared towards the compensating for the power units. They're being written for the power units, not for the chassis themselves. So again, that interpretation of who's got a good engine and then makes that chassis around that engine, incorporating those regulations that have been written for that engine, might actually increase the performance of that engine to the point where it's even more dominant what the FIA wants. Now, we know they want closest. We know the whole point of the engine regulations coming is a bit of diversity with the engines. The one thing about Honda pulling out was, of course, we got that engine equalization that's in Formula One currently, where pretty much all of the engines, with the exception of Alpine, are operating at the same level. So no one's got an engine advantage. So it's actually now all been about the aerodynamics in the current era of Formula One regulations, which has been really good to see, really good for the sport, really good to see the teams actually get closer together as they get more used with those developments after, of course, Red Bull hit the floor running on this one. But what Adrian's saying is, with these new regulations, the potential for a dominant engine is almost twofold because of the way the chassis regulations are written to go around that engine, how that power unit works. You're almost, if you get a good engine and then a good understanding of the regulations, you can actually almost double down your engine advantage, so to speak, which is really interesting to hear him talk about it. We've also heard from Honda this week where they've come out openly and said that their engine ain't quite where they want it to be for 2026, and they got some major concerns over it. This could, of course, be a double bluff. This could be the famous old, we've got some concerns, but actually it's going fine. We just don't want our competitors to know. We're hearing noise and rumblings about engines all the time. Some are true, some are not true. We don't know performance-wise. The teams aren't benchmarking against each other. They've got an idea where they want to be. So they've got an idea about where on their program, their development, they want to be by a certain point in terms of test bench runs, in terms of output, in terms of reliability runs they're doing. They know where they should be on that point of view. What they don't know is what their competitors are doing. Now, the competitors will hype, they will go down, they will do all sorts. And is this just a Honda smokescreen of saying, we're not where we want to be, when actually they are? Or is it a genuine concern? Now, for those who have followed the Honda engine story, remember, they pulled out from Red Bull. Now, when they pulled out and Red Bull decided that they were going to make their own powertrains, obviously in conjunction with Ford, a lot of the key people from the Honda powertrain department went across the Red Bull powertrain department. They also went and poached a load from Mercedes as well. They also even got some from Ferrari. So that Red Bull powertrain program has been, has created a influx of different engineers, which Red Bull have done a great job of pulling in and making that engine department in terms of the new engine going forward. But what that's left Honda is a extreme shortage, because they weren't intending to be in Formula One. They had no intention to still be here. Suddenly they did that U-turn, they come back. We know that they moved a lot of the operation to America in terms of the HRC operation from Japan. And we know, of course, they got exclusive engines with Aston Martin for 2026, which can be a good thing. I mean, the Honda Adrian Newey partnership can be a strength for them. Adrian's talked about actually he's missed not having an engine sort of input where he can build the car around it. This new regulations gives you that. So it could actually be a position of strength for Aston Martin, not a weakness, and Honda putting the bluff. It could, of course, be that they're on the back foot and they're scratching around and it's going to take a while to get going, and they're going to be relying on Adrian's aero package to save them a bit. So Fernando Alonso will be having nightmares with GP2 Honda engines, I'm sure about it. Whether or not it's a bluff, it remains to be known. A lot of talk about Mercedes having the strongest engine, but it's not based on anything really factual. It's just based on what we're hearing. A lot of speculation over whether or not Red Bull can give Max a decent engine to compete, and whether or not that might be the deciding factor that makes Max either look elsewhere in terms of a team or even elsewhere outside of the championship. So the engine regulations for next year are absolutely monumental. And of course, the unknown around Audi coming in. We've obviously got Cadillac. I keep calling them Andretti. We've obviously got Cadillac joining, but they're obviously using the Ferrari power units going forward. And of course, Alpine has dropped theirs for the Mercedes one. But just because Mercedes supply the most teams, that doesn't necessarily mean they've got the best engines. And likewise, because they got the last set of engine regulations spot on, that doesn't mean they've got this set of regulations spot on. So just be careful, is what I'm saying, when you're hearing about engine regulations and when you're hearing about one team's got the upper hand on it, because it may not be true. And, you know, me personally, I always, when Adrian says something, it's normally coming from a position of he doesn't tend to feed much bullshit to the press, if I'm being honest. What he says has relevance and has gravitas, and when he gives these interviews, they're not very often. It's worth always looking at what he's talking about and what's on his mind, because invariably he's right what he says. And if you've got Adrian Newey telling you that this could be a engine dominant era this time round, rather than an aero ground force dominant era, which is obviously what we had since regulations changed in 2022, then it's probably worth listening to him, to be honest, because I know for sure Aston Martin are. But for me personally, with regards to next season, I think it's exciting to have all of these questions up in the air. It's going to make the grid, pretty much we will have no idea what's going on. We would all be guessing when they hit testing next season of who's got it right, who's got it wrong, and there will be no way of knowing until the first Grand Prix. So it makes it exciting. Has someone, compromised performance for reliability, for example? Has someone found something in the new regulations? Has a team like Audi, who's got experience with this engine combination, got the upper hand? So many questions, Can Honda and Adrian come together with that state-of-the-art facility they got in Aston Martin and build a championship-winning car? Have Red Bull and Ford actually behind the scenes been developing what could be the strongest engine between the two? There's so many questions with no answer to, which just makes next season even more mouth-watering potentially than what this season is. But when Adrian Newey is talking about the concerns that we could have an engine-dominant era, I kind of hope he's wrong, if I'm honest. But then likewise, like I say, he's normally coming from a position of strength and certainly a position of knowledge of what he's on about. So I, for one, are keeping a keen, close eye on what next season brings with regards to engines. Right. What's next? Sip of the coffee is next. We've got Yuki Tsunoda and that Red Bull reserve role. Now, with regards to Yuki Tsunoda, he's, of course, driving for 𝐷𝐿𝐴. This announcement this week, there was a bit of confusion over my post. I didn't quite make it as clear as I should have done. But he's still driving for 𝐷𝐿𝐴. That seat isn't going anywhere. He's got a contract up until the end of 2025. Now, what Red Bull did this week, they announced that Yuki would be their reserve driver for the 2025 season. Now, what this means is if Max or Liam can't compete in a race, they would then call Yuki up. What that would then call Iwasa up to 𝐷𝐿𝐴 to compensate for Yuki. So this is what they're doing. Now, this is, of course, a move that many of us saw coming. We know that Ferrari have got a similar deal with Oliver Behrman at Haas, so even though he's got a multi-year deal with Haas, there's talk that Ferrari, alongside Antonio Giovinazzi and probably another reserve, have the option to call on Ollie Behrman if they wanted to, and could also make it work for Haas in terms of Haas and their reserve driver and things. So there's a lot of this goes on anyway, so it's not a major shock. Some people have seen it as an insult to Yuki. I'm not so sure it is. It's kind of a bit like a market employee, if I'm honest, with Honda, because I'm sure they're trying to get him some runs in the car, maybe get those pictures that Honda so desperately want before the end of that partnership. We know that Honda pushed for the end of season test in Abu Dhabi at the end of 2024 because they wanted Yuki in a Red Bull, because ironically, that was pretty much the first time ever under that partnership that we'd seen Yuki in a Red Bull rather than in their sister team. So, Honda were very keen to push for that, and obviously Red Bull were happy to oblige by that. And I feel that this is a bit of that, where we get lots of press shots of Yuki in Red Bull gear rather than 𝐷𝐿𝐴 gear, maybe some testing as well. We know that Max isn't the biggest fan of testing, a bit like most of the Formula 1 drivers actually aren't, but actually Yuki would probably jump at the chance to get in there. Now, we also know that I did an article over on Fan Amp, so if you haven't already, please check that one out. This is about Yuki Tsunoda and what it means. Goes a lot more in depth on it, but what I've talked about is I think there's a distinct depth of drivers missing from the Red Bull Driver Academy. And what I mean by that is they've made these cutbacks over recent years, where years ago, Red Bull had a multitude of junior drivers on their books. Then they made a conscious decision to streamline it and go for quality over quantity. And in a nutshell, with obviously Daniel Ricciardo leaving after the Singapore Grand Prix last year, and obviously Sergio Perez leaving at the end of the season, it's actually left them with a shortage of drivers who actually hold a super license. Now, as it stands, they've only got their 4 drivers, obviously the 2 for 𝐷𝐿 and the 2 for Red Bull, and Iwaza as a super license holder. Now, we know that they've got Arvid is doing his Oceania Championship in New Zealand. I had a complete mind blank then on that one. So he's doing that so that he can get his super license points up, but he's just 17. But if he gets that win, he's won 5 out of 6 regular races, I believe. So he's well on course to win that. He'll get the 14 points that go with that championship, and that would take him over 40 points and give him a super license. Now, they want that because they want to put him in the car, but he's young. He's 17 years old. It's a risky move to push him too fast and have an incident with him and knock his confidence. So I think the plan is to get him in for a couple of rookie sessions, to maybe give him 2, maybe even 4, depending on what they want to do. You probably get the 2, maybe the 2 for 𝐷𝐿𝐒 or the 2 for Red Bull, because they've got a lack of drivers who can do that now. Like I say, Iwaza will do it, and then Arvin will do it, but he's one for the future, and he's one they want to keep an eye on. But with the exception of him, they've got nothing outside. So effectively, if he gets his, they've only got 6 drivers, which sounds a lot, but when you've got 4 seats, it's not actually that much of a cushion. And if something happens when them drivers early on, then you're in trouble. We never want anything to happen to drivers, but we saw, obviously, with Daniel being out and Liam having to step in, it does happen. It can happen. And I'm sure 𝐷𝐿𝐒 Marko is probably looking nervously over his shoulder over what's going on in terms of the driver pool. But for me, it made sense to have Yuki in that role. It makes sense to keep him in that role, even if it is just more of a marketing and seeing out at the end of his contract. But like I say, if you want to know more about the Red Bull driver pool, head on over to FanAmp, just search my name on there and you'll see the articles that I've written. And it's the latest one where I talk about, is the Red Bull pool basically drying up? So yeah, head on over and check that one out. Then we've got Johnny Herbert and Stewards to close off this week's episode. So with regards to this, I wanted to cover them both off because they are kind of relevant. So we saw the news this week that Johnny Herbert will no longer be a steward for the upcoming season. He was down to do the opening in Australia, but the FIA released a statement yesterday saying that due to a conflict with his outside work, that he would no longer be a steward going forward. Now, they've obviously made Johnny choose. Now, for those who don't know, so stewards are a volunteer role. They come into it, they get expenses paid for, and that's all they get for the role. We've talked about professional stewards on the podcast. We talked about it on the channel many times. I'm a big advocate for it. I have been for absolutely ages. And all I've seen recently is more about how that should be the case, how that's actually the way forward. Now, with regards to Johnny Herbert, he does media work, so he gives interviews. He also does a lot of work for a couple of better websites as well. And basically, it's a conflict of interest. You can't have it. I know there's been talk about British bias, all this, but ultimately, strip all of that away. You've got a steward who works for a gambling company who is directly influencing the race in a position where he can influence not only that, but also he can influence on, betting and outside stuff. And it's a situation you just don't want from the FIA. It's a situation you just don't want to put yourself in that position. And why would you? It opens you up to all sorts of talks on your integrity. It calls into account everything. Why would you do that? So ultimately, they've made a choice where they said to him, you either carry on with the paid work or you be a steward, but you can't do both. Now, also, with regards to the interviews as well, he was giving interviews where he was giving his honest view, probably as an ex-racing driver, on situations on track. Now, what that does, that creates, like I say, this bias. And also, it questions every decision you make. So if there's a 50-50 call, it's going to put into question your comments that you said previously a week before on a website or in a Sky interview or whatever that interview may be, paper interview, whatever it looks like. It's going to call that into question. Now, that's not to say that stewards shouldn't have a view on things. My point is they shouldn't have a view where they're openly talking to the press about it and they're openly airing what those things are. Of course, they will have a view on situations. Of course, they will have an opinion on what drivers do. They're human after all. That's why we have humans in this role and it's not automated. So there will always be a human element in this role. There will always be I suppose there'll always be some sort of bias, and we've got to get away from British bias. We've got to get away from that. And we've got to make a point where we are now having independent stewards. And to do that, like I say, this is a start in the right direction. This is what the FIA are doing. And whilst we criticise them, we've also got to come out and go, do you know what? We need to praise them when they do a good job. We need to praise them when they do it right. And we need to praise it when they make the right call. This is the right call to remove Johnny from his role as a steward because of the outside influence. You wouldn't have a referee in football working for Sky Bet, for example, and then going out on a Saturday and refereeing a match. It wouldn't happen. You wouldn't do it. So why is it fine in Formula One? Why is it okay? Because ultimately, that's what the stewards are. They are Formula One's referees to decide what goes on. You wouldn't do it in other sports. So why has it been acceptable for so long in Formula One? Why is it taking so long before we get to this point and before we get to this position where actually we're looking at this from an objective, logical point of view and removing people from their role if there's a conflict? It's the right thing to do. Same as relationships with engine manufacturers, teams. If there's that in Formula One in terms of stewarding, it should be removed. We need to go back to impartiality to protect the rules and also to protect the stewards going forward, because ultimately we can't race without them. We can't rock up in Australia with no stewards without the FIA. We all might have a personal opinion on what's going on at the FIA and how it's being run. But ultimately, without them, we can't go racing. So we need to find a way to work together. And for me, this is a step in the right direction. Now, you couple that with the stewards department, which they've also announced last year, but they've announced the start of it, the commission of it this year. And what this is basically, this is commissioned to provide training for the next generation of officials. And the aim is to make them professional, either full-time or part-time. They haven't decided on that one yet. But the aim is, if they're professional or part-time, they've got time to evaluate, they've got time to analyse, they've got time to coach, support. Sound familiar? We've been on about this for ages. So thank you for listening to the podcast FIA, because I'm sure you got the idea from there. I'll claim my fees via a ticket to a race somewhere maybe, or maybe even a role as a steward. We'll go for that one. But how great is this to hear? Now, the problem with this is it's not instant. It's not going to happen overnight. We can't just whip all the stewards out and put them in, nor can we make all of the volunteer stewards full-time. It might not be something they want to do. Some of them have other jobs, outside careers, outside interests, as we've proven with Johnny Herbert. So how do we get that? We've got to go through a transition phase. We've got to go through a phase where, do you know what? We've got to make it where it's coming, and we've got to give the FIA time to do that, and time to do it right, and time to recruit it right, and time to train it right, and time to develop it right. It's hard, I know. Yeah, we all want to see change overnight. Now, Zach Brown has talked this week about how he, as boss of McLaren, would be happy to pay for professional stewards, providing, of course, the other teams come on board. Not himself personally. He doesn't want McLaren paying for stewards, because that would just be wrong. What he's saying is, as part of the license fee, the entry fee that Formula One teams pay, if all of them are in agreement to paying for part of that going towards stewards, he's saying, why not? He's saying the cost of full-time stewards can't be that much in the rounds of Formula One in terms of how much money they earn, how much they pay into an entry fee. What he's saying is that money shouldn't be the barrier on this. It should actually be that it's negotiated and it's fine. The FIA, in their defence, have said they want the teams to pay for it because they're a non-profit organisation. Everything they have is reinvested in, and they can't afford to do new projects. So if you've got the teams saying that we're willing to consider it, and you've got the FIA saying we've got a department and we want to do it, then let's do it. Come on. It's not rocket science, is it? We've got the Concord Agreement coming up next year. Let's just write it in there that part of the licence fee that the Formula One teams pay goes towards creating professional stewards. It funds that department from that point of view. There's nothing wrong with that. That's not going to make it biased anyway, because all the teams are doing it. It's not going to make it one-sided anyway. It will just make it accountable. It will make it right. It will give it a budget. It will give it some structure. It will allow the FIA to move forward with these plans. But it's got to start at grassroots. They need to recruit the next generation of stewards. It's no good doing it with existing stewards. You've got to come from the grassroots up. And that's what you've got to do. You've got to get into the other series and get your stewards from there. We're seeing a massive shortage of officials from the FIA, probably because of the abuse they get when things go wrong. I mean, who would want to sign up? It's a role you don't get paid, and all you're going to get is a load of shit for it if you get a decision wrong. It's not exactly an attractive proposition, is it? Okay, you get to go to some races and probably get a nice hotel and get your lunch paid for. But ultimately, if you're getting a load of crap for it, a load of death threats for it, a load of everything else, why on earth would you sign up to be an official in Formula One? You just wouldn't do it, would you? So they need to create it. I said that professional stewards are a must. You can create professional stewards, you can review them, you can train them, you can use older stewards and even ex-stewards to train them. All you don't have is them making that decision on a weekend. So there's nothing wrong with someone like Johnny Herbert training a steward, in a paid role, as long as he isn't the steward at the weekend. Yes, you might get some questions over bias because they've been training them, but ultimately, if you've got a set of stewards, if you're in a paid role, you can review people, you can, performance people, good and bad, you can reward people, you can do things with them for doing a good job. This isn't about rewarding an agenda, this isn't about rewarding a a public pursuit of somebody. This is about actually the FIA having professional stewards who are held accountable for their decisions. It's allowing the teams to feed back into that pool to say, look, do you know what? You got that one wrong. Have a look at it. Here's the reason why. And then for the FIA to look at it and go, actually, we got that one wrong, but we make sure we don't get it wrong going forward. So this new department is pretty good in my book. It's long overdue. It's going to take a while to get into Formula One. It's going to take a while before it gets to where it needs to be. So I feel we're going to have more pain before we get, the gains from it. But I feel it's the right step in the right direction for the FIA and for the future of the sport and protecting the sport and also protecting officials going forward. If they do a job in Formula One, or even in the World Motorsport Series, they should be paid for it. They should be compensated for it. It's a big ask to ask a volunteer to make these decisions without any pay, ultimately, because they can decide championships, they can decide millions of pounds in prize money. There's a lot that goes with it, especially with the scrutiny of modern day social media and how these people's names are made public, how their decisions are made public. We're in an age where the press, content creators like myself, we get hold of all of this information, we push it out there, and that creates pressure for all the stewards to get it right as well. We got to be conscious of that as people pushing that information out. And that's not saying we should be afraid to push that information out, far from it. When a steward makes a decision, they should explain it. And maybe part of this is they do some media work in the sense of they come out and explain why they made that decision. Maybe that would also help in terms of understanding some more. If you had a steward talk to the media where they go, actually, this incident, we did this because of this, and this is why, and this is the rule we looked at, and this is the interpretation of the rule, and this is why we impose that penalty because of this, rather than just hiding behind the document that's posted out at the end of the decision saying, we made our decision, you can't appeal it, ta-da, off you go. Maybe there's a bit around that as well, that there's a spokesman who can answer these questions as well within that professional role, where a bit like we see in football, where the referees explain what they're doing and the reasons why. It goes down a long way and also builds up respect between the competitors and the officials, which at the moment it kind of doesn't feel is there at the moment in Formula One, or it's certainly at a point where it's lacking, and it's at a point where it's probably on the decline and needs to be turned the other way. There's been speculation about people saying let's move away from the FIA, let's go, let Formula One run it themselves. Formula One haven't got the capacity to run Formula One without the FIA. They need each other. Ultimately, the FIA own Formula One's rights and stuff. They give it to, Formula One on this commercial agreement they got. So Formula One, if they broke away, wouldn't have the backing of, the name, they wouldn't have the backing of the tracks, they wouldn't have the backing of the officials. And bear in mind, this isn't just the paid officials. I mean, how many volunteers make up a Formula One race weekend, from stewarding to marshalling to literally, people in scrutineering to people helping out around the track. There's so many FIA volunteers who help make a race weekend, when actually, if Formula One pulled out and said we're going to do it on our own, you'd probably find it costs more than just giving the FIA some extra money for some professional stewards, to be honest. So again, I'm not sure what the issue is, but it feels like it's a step in the right direction, and it feels like it's a move to where we need to be, which is ultimately professional paid stewards in Formula One, either part-time or full-time, whichever one they decide to come up with. But ultimately, it needs to be a point where it's done, and it's done in such a way that actually this is what we want going forward. So that is all of I got this week. I mean, that is just over 30 minutes, so apologies for rambling on. Like I said at the top of the show, if you haven't already, please do me the great favour of hitting that subscribe, like, follow button, whatever is available to you on. It genuinely means the world to me. I'm enjoying this weekly podcast. I wouldn't mind some feedback on it, so if you do get a chance, drop in a comment either on this podcast or even via the social media. If you want to find me, it's Coffee Corner Motorsport on all of the channels. I'm available on all of them now, so just feel free to search me up on there. I've also got my website, which is www.coffeecornermotorsport.com. If you want to head on over there, it piles everything all together. So all of the latest in terms of social media, all of the latest in terms of the podcast, and it's also got contact forms on there and stuff like that. So there's always a way to get in contact with me. So genuinely would appreciate your feedback on it. See if you like this new format of a weekly show. See if it's something you want to continue going forward. I'm enjoying it. It takes a lot more to get into the groove of doing it. So I hope you're bearing with me as we head into, car launch season. We're only a couple of weeks away. We know we've got the February 18th car launch. Lots of talk around liveries and what that means. We've got some stuff going on. I'm checking my phone because something's come up while I've been talking to you. And that is that Ferrari have a new name So they've decided that the name is going to be the SF25 for the car. Now that's no surprise. Last year was the SF24. So Ferrari calling their car SF25 doesn't feel like a break from tradition. So apologies, that's not quite the breaking news we may have wanted on a weekly podcast. But there you have it. The new name for Ferrari for this year for their car will be SF25. You wouldn't have got odds on that in the bookers, would you? But yeah, so car launch is coming up. And then, of course, we head straight into pre-season testing and, of course, the start of the 2025 season. So hopefully you'll join me on that journey. I've got lots of stuff coming up, lots of events going to, lots of hopefully behind-the-scenes stuff, some plans starting to take shape for this season. So, like I say, drop us a follow, keep us informed of what's going on. Let me know your views, because ultimately this podcast is all about engaging you as the listeners and you as the community into bringing you the news, but also having that conversation around what's good in Formula One, what's bad, what's relevant. So if there's anything you want me to talk about on the podcast, feel free to drop that into a comment somewhere as well, and we'll see if we can incorporate it onto it. But yeah, thanks very much for listening. And this is Coffee Corner Motorsport, Four Beans Podcast, the F1 show. And you've been listening to Expresso News with me, Terry.